Hello. The topic of this video is what is light? We've been seeing it our whole life, but what really is it made up of? And how do we use wave variables to describe the properties that we perceive? So what is light? Well, physicists have determined that light functionally is a self-propagating pair of electric and magnetic fields. We sometimes call this a wave packet. And it's also a tiny bit of matter, which is the photon simultaneously. This first image sort of shows the light being depicted as a wave packet. So you notice those waves and you'll see that they're, part of the wave is made of an electric field, part of it's made up of a magnetic field. The word self-propagating means that as one of those fields gets stronger, it creates the other field and vice versa. And we learned about how magnetic fields could be induced by changing electric fields, etc. So that's why we call it self-propagating, because it has both of those fields and they're at right angles to each other. This image is one that I'll be using more in this unit, sort of shows how light can also be visualized as tiny little chunks of these wave packets. And we call those tiny little chunks photons, which I think we talked about way back in optics, but anyway, we'll be seeing that more in this unit as well. Light has a transverse wave propagation style, which basically describes the direction in which the waves are jiggling relative to the direction that the wave is moving. And perpendicular, when the waves are jiggling up and down, which is kind of classic waves, and moving forward at the same time, that's known as a transverse wave. We know light is a transverse wave because we can use an induction filter to polarize light. So an induction filter is essentially a whole bunch of little conductive lines. Imagine it like in the picture that shows it kind of like a fence. And the light that comes from a typical light source like the sun or a light bulb is what's called unpolarized, and that means the light is jiggling in all the different directions, right? We have some of those waves jiggling up and down, some going side to side, etc. But when we run that light through a filter, a polarizer, the light that comes out the other side is all jiggling in the same orientation, right? So the light passing that filter is both dimmer because there's not as much of it, and it's all jiggling in the same direction. And we know this because if we then take a second polarizer and we orient it in the perpendicular direction, on the other side of that polarizer, we actually see no light at all. And this is a demo I like to do in class, which is pretty dramatic and cool. I take two polarizers and hold them in front of the window, and you'll notice that the light through those polarizers is a little bit dim because it's blocking out a bunch of the orientations. But if I take a second polarizer and put it behind it, it doesn't change the brightness or dimness of it all if it's in the same orientation, because the first filter is letting through the up and down jiggles. The second filter lets through the same up and down jiggles. You don't notice a difference. As you start to rotate this filter, it starts getting darker and darker and darker as more of the light is blocked out. And eventually, if you take the second filter and you orient it at completely right angles to the first, then in that region of overlap, you actually see no light at all. So this is a common demonstration. The point is to demonstrate that light is actually a transverse wave, because if light had any other kind of propagation, these polarizing filters would not work that way. Hopefully you remember some of the wave variables from back when we did optics again, or your previous physics classes. But as a reminder, we use the word amplitude to explain the amount of energy in a wave. As far as light goes, that would be what our brain would interpret as the brightness of the light. The word frequency is going to refer to how often the wave crest comes through, and the units for that are waves per second, aka a hertz. And as far as human perception goes, different frequencies are perceived as different colors. The third wave variable that's relevant is the velocity or the speed of light, and a reminder that we actually covered that pretty thoroughly in the optics unit. Velocity is defined as how fast that individual wave pulse can move through the medium, and light travels in a vacuum or in air at the speed of light, which is c, which is 3 × 10⁸ meters per second, light can go through other media like water or glass or diamonds, other things like that. And when light goes through other media, it slows down, but it's still a dramatically fast velocity. The other wave variable is wavelength, which is the distance between consecutive wave crests, and it is measured in meters. And we use the wave equation, which is wavelength equals velocity over frequency, to calculate the relationships between those three wave variables. Your eyes contain specialized cells which help you detect two of those variables, the amplitude and the frequency of light. And those are the only two we can detect. So we can't actually detect the velocity or the wavelength. They're things that we've had, as far as our human eyes goes, there's things that we have to measure using other tools. So if this is a picture of your eye, just as a reminder, the back, the retina surface of your eye has these special little cells. And we have two different types of those cells. We have the rods, and those rods are the ones that detect the amplitude, so how much light is hitting you. And the cones are going to be detecting what the frequency or the color of the light that you see is. Okay, so how do we model amplitude and frequency when we're drawing pictures or just thinking about how those properties that we can detect are represented in waves? So amplitude is best modeled as the number of photons that are hitting your eye. So if you have a light ray that has a lot of amplitude or is really, really bright, it's going to be a light ray that, that contains many of these photons. So for example, a laser shoots out a ton of photons, and that means all the different rods in your eye are all detecting them all at once, and your brain says this is really bright. If you had a little tiny candle, for example, that candle is going to be sending out many fewer photons every second, so your eye detects that as a much dimmer color of light. The frequency of light, or the number of jiggles every second, can be found on the electromagnetic spectrum, which is basically the idea that all light is the same thing. It's just slightly different frequencies are detected and interpreted different ways in our brain. And this electromagnetic spectrum contains all the colors. Some of them are visible to us, and some of them are invisible to us. There's other animals that can actually detect different frequencies than we can, like bees can see ultraviolet light, which is pretty cool. From low frequency to high, this is how I tend to remember these, and you do actually probably need to have this memorized a little bit in your brain for the AP test. We have the radio waves, microwaves, infrared radiation, and then we jump into the visible light chunk, which is the only piece we can see there, and that's the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv. And you'll notice infrared falls right next to red, and that makes sense. It's like a little bit redder than red. And then the other side of visible, we have ultraviolet, and then X-ray, and then gamma rays. The picture that is down below is sort of flip-flopped, right? This is the short wavelength, high frequency side, and this is going to be the long wavelength, low frequency side, but it shows the same electromagnetic spectrum as I just mentioned. So let's do a little bit of an activity here. If you could take on your notes and divide it into a table with dim, bright, low frequency, and high frequency. If I was asking you to draw a picture of light that fit into each of these categories, what would it look like? So for example, a low frequency red light, low frequency dim light would be red, because red is the lowest frequency that we can see, and dim because it only has a handful of photons. So maybe you pause the video now and see if you can fill out the other three parts of the table, and then come back and see my solution. So if I was drawing a bright red light, I would put the same color, so the same sort of spacing with my jiggles. The only difference is going to be that I'm going to have a lot more photons of that light, so my eye would interpret that as a bright red light. As far as changing the frequency goes, so if I go from a low frequency to a high frequency, the difference is going to be both in the way I represent it in that photon, right? Those jiggles have a smaller spacing, but also the color of the light. So we've now changed from red to something that is higher frequency, blue or purple, which is still detectable. But this is still going to be a dim light because there's only a few photons of that purple. And if I was drawing a bright, high frequency light, I would draw lots of photons of that higher frequency color. So all the stuff we talked about in the last couple slides was sort of application of light to the things that you probably learned about in earlier physics classes, there is one thing that is really unique and important that's a difference about light. And that is that for light only light waves, there seems to be a relationship, not seems to be, there is a relationship between frequency and energy. A German mathematician actually originally derived this equation for photon frequency and energy relationship. And so it's called Planck's photon frequency energy equation. And it's pretty straightforward. It shows a linear relationship between E and F. And in this equation, E is the energy of a single photon of light, so one tiny piece. So just note that the E values you're going to get here are going to be really tiny. And H in this is a universal constant known as Planck's constant. And that is on your equation sheet as shown. You'll notice that there are two different H values, 6.63 times 10 to the negative 34th joules per hertz, or joule seconds is the same thing because a second is a inverse hertz. Or more commonly, the one you'll probably be using more often is 4.14 times 10 to the negative 5th EV per hertz, or EV seconds. So an EV stands for an electron volt, and it is the amount of work that is required to move an electron across a potential difference of 1 volt. And this is the more common one that we use because when we're talking about photon level stuff, tiny, tiny things, a joule is a huge amount of energy and an electron volt is a more usable amount of energy. So you can use either of those H values. You want to pick and choose the one that's appropriate to the problem that you are trying to solve. And of course, if you end up with one kind of energy and you need the other, you can convert back and forth between them with this pretty straightforward energy unit conversion. This is also on your equation sheet. So the definition of an electron volt is 1.6 times 10 to the negative 19th joules, because that is the work it would take to move an electron across a volt. Incidentally, if you had more than one photon, if you had a whole bunch of photons, and you wanted to know how much energy was in all of those photons, you would just multiply the energy from one photon times the number of photons. So the energy in a beam of light depends linearly on both the frequency and the amplitude of that light. So one sample problem that you could encounter would be something like saying, that combines all of the ideas from the first two videos. How much mass could you create out of 600 photons of 400 nanometer light? So if you happen to have a beam of light and you wanted to somehow convert the energy from that light into mass, how much could you make? I am going to encourage you to just pause the video and solve it out yourself. But if you need a boost, I'm going to go through the steps and then give you the answer at the end. Okay, so the steps I would take, first step I would do is to convert nanometers into meters because you need to be in the standard units for all of these calculations. 1 nanometer is 10 to the negative 9th meter, so 400 nanometer light is going to be 400 times 10 to the negative 9th meters. Second thing I'm going to do is calculate the frequency of light because the energy depends on the frequency, not on the wavelength. I'm going to assume that everything is in air or vacuum, which I probably should have said at the beginning, but anyway. You're going to be using the wave equation, wavelength equals velocity over frequency, and in this case you are going to assume that the velocity of light is c because we are in a vacuum. Next step is going to be to calculate the energy in a single photon using Planck's equation. So take your frequency and multiply it by h. A note about that, you need to use the h for joules because when we get to using the E equals mc squared equation, we're going to have energy in joules to convert into kilograms of mass. Next step is going to be to multiply the number of photons that are given in the problem, or 600, and then the last step is to convert into mass using special relativity, so E equals mc squared. So that's what I was saying about you have to have energy in joules from step 3 if you want to be able to use that equation in step 5. The solution I arrived at was 3.315 times 10 to the negative 13th. Incidentally, that's a very, very tiny amount of mass, not even enough to make a proton or neutron because of the way those equivalencies come together. So hopefully this sample problem made a little bit of sense to you guys, and you followed along with the steps that you would be using to combine all of these ideas that we've learned so far. Thanks for watching.